they come through. And Susan, thanks for popping your introduction in the chat. Thanks everyone for coming through. So we're really excited today to have our discussion about student engagement. I am here, my name is Nicole Offerdahl, and I'm here with Nicole Wilson from Needles. And we're going to have a discussion today around how she works to prioritize student engagement, and of course, ask you all as well to share your thoughts and give you a lot of opportunities to ask questions and things like that. So let's first start off with introductions. As I mentioned, I'm Nicole Offerdahl. I'm a curricular solutions architect at Newsela. And basically what that means is it's my job to get nerdy with district leaders like yourselves and figure out how to map Newsela's solutions to meet your needs. Nicole, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I am Dr. Nicole Wilson. I earned a PhD back in 2017. I always like to throw that in. It's always something so honoring to get to say. But this is my first year as an assistant principal here in Needles. Prior to that, I did 4 years reading intervention K-8. I opened up an alternative 6 through 12 school for Needles. And then prior to that, I did 8 years in Bullhead City, Arizona, which is about 10 miles north of Needles. We're right on the Arizona, California, and Nevada border. And I did grades 2nd through junior high out there. Actually, I'm sorry, kindergarten through junior high out there. And then actually did a couple years in Southern California when I first credentialed. So been able to bounce all over the map during my time so far.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. It's really, really cool to talk to you today. So today we're going to walk through a couple things. One, we'll talk about some challenges and successes that y'all have experienced engaging students in today's learning environments, knowing that they're probably vastly different across the folks that we have here. We'll get some strategies to prioritize student socio-emotional well-being during this time, and then also think through ways that we can use Newsela to drive more equity and ensure every learner gets what they need. Awesome. So here's our agenda. Of course, we'll do an introduction. We'll talk about student engagement, some of the data that's been collected across the country. And then we'll have our discussion. And throughout that discussion, there will be time for questions. And then, of course, Q&A at the end. So let's just jump right in. So according to a recent EdWeek Market Brief survey, student engagement is really top of mind. And this is #1 for a lot of districts, what they're looking to improve. Especially as they think about making purchasing decisions this year. And so 61, you can see kind of the numbers here and how it all breaks out. So we're curious from you all sort of where your district fell when thinking about this in fall of 2020. So on the screen, I have a poll question. If you could pop in the letter in the chat, which best describes your district's approach in the fall. That way we can get a sense from folks was your district sort of focused on academics or school focused on academics, check in with students with families if possible. Maybe you were doubling down on academics as quickly as possible to get learning back on track. Or maybe you were prioritizing building relationships and meeting students' SEL needs before focusing on academics. Go ahead and pop the letter that describes your experience in the chat. So I'm seeing an A focus on academics. I'm seeing some SEL focus as well. A little bit of mix. Yep, absolutely. Awesome. Thank you all for sharing that. So it sounds like it's a mix of like really, and it sounds like everyone's priority was making sure students and families were checked in on and supported, and then also building in some academics and then some shift over the course of the year. Thank you for sharing that. So we at Newsela were curious about digging into this question a little bit more. And so we actually launched a survey in November 2020, and over 2,000 educators completed this survey. And we believe the results have pretty important implications for how we approach student learning, throughout the year and beyond COVID. Really, I think there's a lot that can be gleaned from this. So surprisingly, in the fall, few districts indicated that they were actually prioritizing student well-being as the top priority. They were instead doubling down on academics out of a concern of sort of the COVID slide or the learning loss, which we know was talked about in the fall. I think this has shifted a lot now that we're seeing sort of the impacts of that loneliness and being separated from our peers, being separated from like our normal ways of life, even if we are in school. And so there's been a shift as well. As far as relevance goes, districts were kind of split on whether they were going to cover like complex topics that were going on in the world, like racism, global warming, and current event topics like that. There was a split because of course relevance is important, but we also need to balance what's responsive to the students and their families. And then differentiation was also a big piece of this. 23% said that their students were infrequently receiving adequate support and scaffolding, which we know from being in the classroom is a really major component of student engagement. Like being able to read what you're given, for example, is a pretty massive way of being engaged. So we just thought this was interesting just from our users to share with you all as well. So now I'd like to open it up to Nicole. Like when you think about student engagement in your district this year, could you kind of paint us a picture both of like kind of the beautiful things that you see happening and also some of the challenges that you're seeing or are seeing, kind of how's that looking?
So as a district, we have been in distance learning for a year now. We have not been able to, especially at the middle and high school levels, have not been able to bring students back on campus. So I think any district right now facing the challenges like we are of engaging kids online, the first thing we see is a lot of black screens or pictures versus student faces, which is really difficult for us to gauge engagement, because in the classroom or when we're going through student teaching and all that stuff, you really base a lot of feedback on student, what their face looks like, how they're handling things in the classroom. And so pulling a teacher out of the classroom has been extremely difficult, has been a huge paradigm shift for our teachers, especially how to Zoom, how to become tech savvy on a new level. And I think that's something we're seeing across the board with a lot of our schools. And when I go into different chats with other school districts, they're definitely facing the same challenges. The other challenge too has been engaging kids in discussion rooms and that type of stuff, and making sure that they're doing the work. So we've had a lot of challenges this year, but I think we've had some really great successes. Our teachers have taken the challenge and stepped up their game of how to incorporate the chat box features into bringing students in. We have a lot of homeless population, and so we've had to be really mindful of kids having their cameras on, because a lot of our students didn't want people to see that they're hiding in a closet in a motel room doing their Zoom or in the back of seat of a car. So we've had to be think above and beyond, be very mindful of our families and how we can help them during this time. So we've gotten creative of using those chat features, using different links, games like Kahoots, or some of those other featured websites that we can engage really well with our students. So, and I'm sure other people are facing the same challenges. And every time I go in and I ask people, what are you doing differently? We all seem to be having very similar focuses.
Yeah, absolutely. I hear that from a lot of district leaders as well. And I think it's really cool that you and your district have sort of taken the opportunity to be really responsive and like kind of reimagine engagement, because you're right. Somebody could be engaged, but not want to show their screen, but be really engaged in the chat or in the Kahoot, and like really kind of opening up how you define engagement. I think that's really powerful. Thank you for sharing that. So now I'd love for you to also kind of reflect on, and you kind of started to touch on it with like talking about Kahoot and things like that. But when you think about what makes a product or instructional strategy engaging for students, Nicole, like how do you think about that? What makes something engaging, and like what are the kids doing that helps you know that they're engaged?
And that's great. I think that's a huge piece that I've been bringing to my teachers is how do we know they're engaged? Well, the first thing we know they're engaged is if they're doing the learning. When I sit in classrooms, I want to hear students. I don't want to hear the teacher. My teachers have gone through school. I know they're extremely knowledgeable, but we really want our students to show us what they know and also work through discussion. I think a lot of us learn really well through discussion. So some of the things that we've talked about here at our site has been, and there's been a huge shift, because when we went to the online world back in March, we have a very poor community. And so we actually started with packets. We did not have the means to get everyone Wi-Fi, to get everyone computers. We didn't have those means back in March when we were shutting down for 2 weeks. And obviously we weren't going to be handing out laptops for 2 weeks because we weren't sure what that would look like. But then quickly we learned 2 weeks now turned into the rest of the school year last year, and now even into this full year. And so our district really got on the bandwagon. We were able to get hotspots for all of our families. We were able to get laptops for one-to-one for all of our students. And now we also had purchased a new program, Pearson Online. So everything was done digitally, but our teachers and our parents were still struggling. I was getting the complaints from parents. Well, my kid doesn't like to read on the computer, or teachers, well, I'm used to reading out of a book. But the reality is we're doing a shift here. And I was trying to explain that to people. We're now doing a shift, and we need to really open our mind. When people say to me, well, they don't like reading out of a book, my question really is, do they not like it? Or are you not comfortable with the shift that we're taking? Because text online is really a way. When I was finishing up my doctorate back in 2015, 2016, everything I had was online. I didn't have the means to print a 100-page research paper to study to help me finish my dissertation. It was out of the question. So I had to get real savvy and start using the resources I had online to make it work. And I think that's kind of where we're at right now. We're seeing a huge shift in education and how we do things. And we are moving from that written world, that paper and pencil type world, to the technology world. And so for us, we really are looking for our kids to be actively reading, looking at things, taking notes, but that doesn't necessarily mean a pen and a paper. That might mean we're using, in Google, we might be pulling up in our Google note-taking skills. They have a great apps for that. We have Google Classroom that we're using. In Newsela, they've done an amazing job of giving us annotation where the kids can actually highlight in different colors, annotate what they're reading to do support. So we know that they're actually thinking through the process of reading. Because one of the hardest things we hear is when kids are working independently, there's no product for a lot of us to come out with. And so we really want a way to know, what are the kids thinking and what are the kids doing? So those annotation products, annotating, the highlighting, asking questions or making mental notes, but actually typing it in on the side. Those are all ways that we're going to be able to monitor engagement for our students. And then of course we have, using these online things, we have our breakout programs. We have breakout rooms where I can actually still do jigsaws with kids and say, hey, I want you to read this first section. Group 2, you're reading the second section. Everyone needs to pick out a point from that section to share out when we come back. So we have some really great engaging tools. We just have to think differently on how we're going to execute it.
And I think that framing that you mentioned of like, there are things that we as adults who have gone through our education system are somewhat attached to because that's what we're used to, and realizing that shift happening in real time. Kids are certainly more comfortable with things that maybe we aren't. And also, I thought what was really powerful, what you talked about around like the ways that we monitor and measure engagement may look different, but they also have connections to what we're familiar with. Annotating, for example, is a way in a book that we demonstrate engagement. It can also happen on a screen, and there's some, gosh, I can't even think of the right word, but there's some like shared sort of understanding that can help us bridge to that more digital environment, and gives teachers the opportunity to sort of check in on how students are engaging with materials, and sometimes gives visibility that they may not have had being able to walk between desks in a classroom too, which is cool.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. So now I kind of want to dive in deeper into some more specific topics, and I'll give also the folks in the room chances to chat in about this as well. So I want to talk first about something that we know drives engagement, which is like students are in the right mindset to learn, which there's a lot of factors that contribute to that. But we know that SEL is a big piece of that. And so I'm curious from the crowd first, if you want to just chat in, how are you prioritizing students' SEL well-being during this disruption, and what strategies and resources are your teachers using? And how do you balance student well-being with the need to catch students up academically? Would love to have folks chat in before I have Nicole share out what she is doing with her work. And I'll give us some wait time, which is hard over Zoom.
I think wait time's hard, just period.
It is. It really is. So go ahead and chat in your thoughts here. Give you about another minute, and then we'll hear Nicole. Well, Nicole, I think folks really want to hear from you. How are you prioritizing socio-emotional well-being during this disruption? Would you talk to these questions, please?
I think social-emotional is huge, and especially being a middle school assistant principal this year, anyone who's working in the middle school setting knows that they're already going through a lot. And now I actually have a son, my son's in 8th grade, my daughter's in 4th grade. So as a mom, there's a lot there. Social-emotional is important because I know my son personally, who is a baseball player and does travel sports, and all of this has really taken a toll on him, not being able to see his friends every day, not having school sports. They were canceled the second game into the season last year, and this year hasn't had the chance to even go back out there and do that. And all the stuff that he was used to. We have kids living, like I said earlier, in motel rooms. We have students who are homeless. We have students that have parents that are fearful of what's been going on. We have students who have had many people that they know pass away from this. So social-emotional has been extremely on the forefront in our district. I see one of the teachers wrote in here, they do brain breaks in their classroom, they do yoga stretching, and all of that's super important. One of the things that we've done here at the middle school we rearranged our schedule in our last period, which normally is an elective, which, don't get me wrong, I think electives are extremely important, but are extremely hard to do right now over Zoom, especially band and art and all that stuff. So this year, to enhance that, we've created more of a study hall time, but it's also a time for teachers to check in, and it's more of an elective period where they can step in and just check in on kids. Hey, how are you doing? Hey, I noticed this grade isn't so well. What can we do to help you? We've done a lot of those things where we've really rearranged our schedule to meet with students and break things down into smaller groups to try to help them. We are also building in some other things. One of the things we're doing in our reading class our writing classes, we've started Article of the Week. And the Article of the Week is it's intended for a couple things. Research tells us that if kids read 15 minutes a day, they are going to do huge things when it comes to testing or just making advances in their own academics. So we know that. We also know that kids who can relate and actually build some empathy for others and actually can start putting themselves into other people's shoes are building that empathy, but they're also learning how to work through their own problems. And so now we are starting to work on Article of the Week in our writing class. So we can build with the standard of written response to something, letting the kids build an opinion or letting the kids argue something. But at the same time, we're being very mindful of what we pick, and we're going to look at some things that might address what kids are going through at this moment in time. Whether it's financial hardships, whether there's just different things we've looked at. And so we've taken the idea of social-emotional and really trying to open people's eyes up how we can adjust this and actually help our students and look at the positive. During these hard times, a lot of us immediately look at the negative. My school board, being one of them, recently was asking about learning loss and what's the learning loss? What's the learning loss? And I finally looked at them all and I said, can I throw a spin on this that we're probably missing? And the spin is, what have our students gained that we haven't had in the last 10 years? And the thought of that was really eye-opening, because if you think about my own 2 kids are at home most of the day when I'm here working in my office and dealing with stuff. They're not with me. I don't have room to put them. Our school district's been closed. So my kids have had to learn how to do a schedule on their own, and they've had to learn how to be very proactive in getting their work done and showing up to their classes. that kind of stuff. That doesn't mean at night when I come home, I'm not checking homework and I'm not helping them with what needs to be helped with. But what that does mean is that they've had to take the initiative to be a little bit more organized on their own, and they have to be leaders, and they have to take care of things that they haven't been requested to do in the past. Well, there's some life lessons there that they've learned, and that's been really great for them. And actually, it's helped them because they built confidence. And now that they've had to go through it, it's actually helped them.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think for us, some of that balance too is not just, we get so caught up on the academics that we forget about the life skills that we've also have allowed kids to start building and getting that they didn't have before. So, so I think that there's some huge shifts in what we're doing. But we, again, looking at kids' needs, taking some time to do some one-on-one, that's really, really important.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that kind of echoes what Sandy popped in the chat there around giving students opportunities to socialize, be it bringing them in person on campus for small group interactions or providing virtual small group time to interact and things like that. And I thought it was so cool how you highlighted that, like, right now students are building other skills and skills of resiliency and oh my gosh, I almost said fine motor skills, and that's definitely not what you said, but the skills of like responsibility and keeping track of schedules and yes, all of those important things that is so hard for middle schoolers especially to learn. And then something else I wanted to highlight out of what you said too was you were talking a lot about how like you're really pairing academics and socio-emotional work too. I think when we talked in preparation for the presentation, something that really stood out to me too was how in the writing, like, yes, students are writing argumentative and opinion pieces, and they're also being asked to practice empathy by thinking about questions like, how would you feel in that student's or that the person's shoes and things like that, which I think is a really powerful, it's again, building that skill and flexing that muscle. Thank you for sharing that. And thank you, those of you who popped in the chat. It's really cool to hear from you. Okay, I want to shift now to thinking about more like current and relevant content, because that's also a piece of engagement. And so one of the things I'd like to hear from you, Nicole, is like, what do you expect from teachers when it comes to incorporating current content and how you're supporting them? And then also, what guidance do you provide teachers in making connections between, say, past and present in like a social studies context or like literature and the ever-changing world? And folks, feel free to pop in the chat as ideas come to you, as Nicole shares too. Sorry to cut you off, Nicole. Go for it.
No, absolutely. I love reading all the comments. It's like I love connecting with people. One thing when it comes to incorporating current content, one of the things that's been a huge shift over the last few years, and I think a lot of districts, especially the smaller rural districts, I feel sometimes because we don't have some of the resources that our larger urban areas have. So when we made that shift, it's been a long time now, really, from our old standards to more the college and career readiness standards. One of the things that we have noticed the shift is it isn't a list anymore of what we're teaching. There isn't that list of, oh, I'm going to teach this today and I check it off, and I hit those standards. Now it's really a combined list, and it integrates very intricately. And so when we're incorporating what we're teaching, we really want to make connections in multiple subjects and really see them weave together. And so when we do that, I'm really looking at what my teachers are pulling in the text of what they're doing and how can we now build connections. And one of the areas, I have a new teacher this year teaching 8th grade history. I don't know what anyone knows, but 8th graders in history is very difficult because they know it all, first of all. And second of all, the past is the past in their eyes. Nothing's going to change. So really taking the idea of, she was covering the Boston Massacre. And I said, how can you take the Boston Massacre and connect it to relevant issues today? So finding something that has a similar pattern or has something similar and connecting it. And that is really important because there's a lot of social events over history that repeat themselves, obviously not identically, but we can learn from the past and we can look at how we could do it differently. And so that is a huge piece that we want to see that connection brought into, because again, we know when we look at our levels of learning, you've got just those first two levels, which are very fact-based, you know, coming back level 1, vocabulary type things. You've got level 2, again, not super depth, but then 3 and 4 and DOK, we're really looking at starting to do analysis of text or analysis of thinking. And then the ultimate connection is putting yourself in that position. And if you were in that shoes, how would you do it differently? Or how can something be different or show different, you know, and you're really connecting real world. So I think that's super important for our kids. And it's neat for our middle schoolers who know it all to start really giving you their, what I call their book of knowledge. My son, his name's Tyler. I always say, oh, Tyler's book of knowledge is coming out. We know, but it's neat to watch them think things through and start guiding them those questions. But one of the other things that I try to tell my teachers is, and this is where, and I want to say I'm not being paid by Newsela. I have used Newsela for about 10 years. I am a huge proponent for this program, to the point where our superintendent just this year finally purchased it, but they offer so many great free features that every teacher really has no reason not to use it. But what I really love is when I was an RTI teacher, and I did it for 4 years, just these past 4 years, when I got to middle and high school RTI, these kids knew how to read. We were not talking, they're at the point of middle school, if they don't know how to read, they're not in response to intervention kids. Those are kids that we need to be testing for maybe a learning disability. So I'm talking kids that just didn't have the confidence, just didn't have the miles on the tongue to keep up with the text, because we know kids in middle and high school and even upper elementary at this point, yeah, they might be stumbling over some multisyllabic words and they might not know every phonics pattern, and they might, you know, they don't know everything, but they have enough behind them that if they could just get some miles on the tongue, they're going to become pretty strong readers. And so when I worked with my middle schoolers in intervention, we really spent time, and I would pick different books. And one of my favorite, we did it every year in my 7th and 8th grade. 6th grade's a little young, maturity wise, they're not there, is I used this book called A Long Walk to Water. It is a phenomenal book. If you haven't read it, it's only about 100 pages. It's a pretty quick read, but it's a story of a boy who grew up in Southern Sudan during the Civil War in the 80s. And then in the early 90s. And then in 2000, it was about a 2009 or 10, there's a young girl who's living in the same area he grew up in. And so it's two coinciding stories happening at the same time. Well, he was a refugee and went through the refugees camp, finally made it to America in his early 20s, learned English, got a high school diploma, was able to go to college, and now actually has a nonprofit where he is helping get water to these areas in the South Sudan because they don't have running water, they don't have fresh water. And one of the biggest things is people die because of disease. And so we read this book every year, and it's a great book to build empathy. We are a small rural area in the desert, so it was really great connections my kids were able to make, because it gets 120 here in the summer. I don't know where it is like you, but here can be 120, 125 for a couple days. It's pretty hot. And so our kids were able to really understand what he went through and the terrain and all that, because we live here and we have those connections. Well, during the book, I would pull articles from Newsela that actually talked about the Sudan and let them actually realize that this is real, and we would draw connections to where they live out there to hear issues with water, and really building that empathy and building some real world connections and some real world just understanding that outside our little box, there's so much more. Because I don't know about you guys, but working in a small rural area, and I've been here for almost 15 years now, my students don't travel outside this little area. Our closest big city is Las Vegas, about an hour and 45 minutes away. And they don't go there very often, if ever. And so they don't understand outside their world. When we talk about major connections of, we had social issues with Black Lives Matter and all that stuff, my kids did not understand it because we don't have those issues here. They don't even, I mean, we have a huge Native American population, but so many of us have tan or darker skin. The idea of color is not something that's brought to, because there isn't a lot of it. So they didn't understand a lot of that. And so when you still have to bring in those things by doing it in different ways and showing justice. I was able to bring in a lot of it through talking about refugee camps and how we treat people in those refugee camps. And boy, if we had treated them differently, look at this one boy who was in the refugee camp. It's changing the lives for thousands. You know, it's really important. So had those refugee camps given him a real option, think of what he could do even on a bigger level. So again, for me, we really tried to build those connections. You know, to me, the academics will take care of themselves if you do it right. I don't stress about the standards, because the standards will always take care of themselves if I'm teaching the kids to think and build. Now, I'm not saying we don't look at them and make sure they're being taught. What I am saying, though, is the standard itself will take care of itself. This test will always take care of itself if I'm doing justice in the way I teach it.
Well, and I think what you were saying about like how powerful it is to be able to make those higher DOK, like by helping students make those text to text, text to self, text to past connections, it's pushing a higher DOK, which will inevitably lead to more rigor, which is in line with the standards and the expectations out of the standards, which I think is really powerful. Yeah. And it's like, yeah, we're not that. It's funny that you use the Boston Massacre example, because I literally asked my nephew, he was learning that in the fall, and I asked him, you know, how does this connect to what's going on today? And he was like, I don't even know. I drew a picture of it. Do you want to see that? And I was like, I mean, okay. But it's like that recall, it's only getting him so far when there's so much to be connected to today. When Sandy was sharing in the chat too about how she connected what was happening, that she had her students watch the inauguration, and then they read and annotated The Hill We Climb by Amanda Gorman, and just like how powerful things can be for students once you make those connections and help them make those connections for them. So thank you for sharing that. And Sandy, thank you for sharing too. So now, before we get to some Q&A time, I just want to also talk about, and you were actually started to get there already, so this might be a fast conversation for this part, but I think challenge is a big part of feeling engaged too. Like if I'm bored, I don't want to participate in what you talked about a little bit earlier about like students having like the ability to read a little, like even if they can read and they're still working on it, but if they can comprehend, that gets them a really like pretty far way there, and it's still challenging. So I'm curious what approaches you and your district have taken to make sure that all students have that opportunity to be engaged and motivated in their learning. And how are you engaging students in different populations or with different levels of needed for accommodations?
So I think any teacher is going to tell you the hardest thing to do is to find something where all your kids can read. And I taught, like I said, multiple grades, kindergarten all the way through 12th grade, and you're always going to have multiple different levels. That's always going to be there. But I do think finding, you know, and not all the content's going to engage everyone, but being able to really find connections and find what works for your kids is super important, which takes building relationships, getting to know your students. You know, if our teachers don't know who they're teaching, they're never going to reach them, because our students, they need that. They need those connections. They need those moments. So that's one of the first things, is every opportunity to be engaged. A lot of it has to do with just building the relationships, having the respect factor from teacher to student. And then I think on top of that is posing questions for students to really think it through and engage their learning on multiple levels. So everyone feels like their opinion matters and their thought process matters. From there, we want to look at our text. And you know, we have always a base text that's kind of in the middle, and we have kids that they can read it, some kids that struggle with it, some kids that blow right through it, and then we have kids who just can't read it at all. And so when you're working with that kind of text, you always want to work around how we can engage everyone in that moment, whether you do a jigsaw, whether you, I always gave kids a chance to read silently before we ever read anything out loud. I hated the fact when you walk into class and someone give it and go, I want you to read paragraph 1 and you to read paragraph 2, and you haven't even looked at the text. I don't know about you guys, but even as a teacher, I would pre-read something to make sure I knew what it was saying before I would get out there and give it. So giving kids the opportunity to pre-read something and ask questions. Hey, what is this word? I don't know it. We had an activity. I would have them always pre-read it, and they had a highlighter and they could highlight, or they had Post-its. I love Post-its, they're my favorite. And they would have a Post-it note and they would write the word that they didn't know or they couldn't figure it out. So we would talk about that before, we got into reading. And I told kids, I expect you to come up with a word or two. I mean, shoot, I'm an adult and I still some days I'm like, what? Siri, tell me what this word says. So I think that's really important. But the other cool thing is when you're taking something deeper is you want to be able to change that text. So one of the things I love about Newsela and why I've used it in interventions and why I've used it in all my classrooms when I taught, especially, and again, you're going to target, this is really targeting grades 3 on up. First, second grade where you're still learning how to read. I'm not saying Newsela doesn't have great resources for them, but I'm using Newsela more as reading to learn. So I'm using this as text to learn from, not how to read. So I just want to make that very clear. This is when I'm actually having kids engaging in learning in the fact that I want them to gather information to use towards something. Newsela, I can break it down over a span of, I want to say 5 or 6 different levels, and it can go all the way down to second, all the way up to high school. Now, depending on the article you pick will depend on that span. But, when I was especially working with middle schoolers, I would be able to bring that down a grade level or 2 to make sure the vocabulary and make sure what's being talked about is at the level of their reading. And then sometimes I would actually pull the higher one after that was a little more difficult. And then after we read the one, we would look at the other one and kind of compare them, and they would realize pretty much the content itself is the same. Maybe some of the facts they learn are a little different. The length is different, the higher it goes, the longer that article usually is. But the kids itself would be able to see that. And what was great is I never told kids I did this. I never told them I would break it down or bring it down to their level. What I would do sometimes is in a classroom of 30 kids when I taught 4th grade is I would print 5 or 6 copies of each of the different levels because I knew where my kids were. And I would jigsaw them. But I would say, you're going to get this article today, you're going to get this one, you're going to get this one. So at the table, I had 4 or 5 different reading levels. They all had different articles. They were all about the same thing, but they didn't realize it was the same article changed, because the cool thing about Newsela is it doesn't make it that clear. And so they would all be able to read and pick out 2 or 3 facts and go around and share, and they all got to be engaged in it. Now I don't have one person doing all the work and everyone else messing around, because they all have something different sitting at the table. And so those are some great different differentiation pieces without kids knowing I'm differentiating, because that is one of the hardest things sometimes is those kids that are lower or those kids that are higher. They love to point out who is where. And so they didn't know, they didn't get it, because when I handed, some kids would notice that his article was shorter than theirs. And I was like, oh, luck of the draw. They don't know. I mean, obviously behind the scenes, there was some work there, but they didn't know that. I didn't make that be known. And that's part of that culture piece that you build in those classrooms. So how do I engage those supports? You break it down for them, but you don't necessarily tell them you're doing that either.
Yeah, it kind of depends. And something we've seen too virtually, kind of those same structures at play. I've seen a lot of Kagan structures being used like through breakout groups. So I've seen like breakout room jigsaws where they send the text to the students virtually and it's automatically leveled by Newsela, and the students all read, come in their breakout groups, have a discussion. They come back with a virtually filled out Google Doc and then have a whole class discussion. So I see the same Kagan structure. I love Kagan, so I'll name those, but they're
love him.
Like, I think I still have the book, even though I'm not teaching anymore.
Absolutely.
But
good teaching is good teaching.
Exactly. And they're really powerful and can be leveraged virtually as well. There's a lot that can be done to engage students with that virtually, and it translates back into the classroom. Like what I loved about the strategies you were sharing too is it's like, as we're starting to think about, like, we're presented with a unique problem around student engagement right now, because we don't have students in front of, well, I'm saying there's no students in front of teachers right now where we can pretend that they're engaged because they're quiet and compliant, right? And it's like, now we have this opportunity to learn these new engagement tools so that when we have them back in the classroom, we know that quiet and compliant is the same as a black screen and not responding to the chat and things like that.
Absolutely. And I think too, one of the things we forget most often is some of that quiet compliant that we had in the classroom that we always, some people like to gauge as good, good students. Those were the ones that were flying under the radar. And those were the ones that I would end up picking up in RTI in 5th, 6th grade, because for years they flew under the radar. We don't want to see that. And I wanted to just piggyback on something you had said about, the virtual things. One of the great things that I really love, and I'm sure some people have heard this, maybe not many, as I remember when we were making the shift from paper pencil stuff to computer-based testing. And I remember being a teacher who was super frustrated with it, because I really spent time teaching my kids really good strategies to pull information out when it came to a test. How do I get in there and highlight? How do I get in there and really go back into the text and find the answer or find the support to answer a question? I want to see arrows drawn. I want to see connections made. I was that teacher who really made kids go back and prove. They couldn't turn a test in unless it was marked up in my classroom. Because if they did, then that tells, if they turned it in without marking it up, to me, they didn't spend enough time really going through the material.
Yeah.
And so when we went to computer-based testing, I was a huge advocate against it, because I said, how are my kids going to do this? How are they going to, they can't write all over the computer screen. They can't take their highlighter. Well, and granted, back when they first started, they didn't have some of those tools, the text highlighting and the annotations. But now that we have that, and we do have the shift, we have to teach kids how to use that prior to that test. And then I probably sound like I'm teaching in the test. That is not my point, because when I did my PhD and I had, and you're writing a dissertation and you end up having 75 different resources or whatever, you have to be able to, you can't print all that out and have it there. You have to keep it logged on the computer. And so you're really teaching kids life skills, because my sister, who works in the medical field, insurance medical field, where they have to do some research and they do some stuff, same thing. She goes, I can't print things out. They don't want us to kill trees anymore. Everything's done electronically. And she goes, it's been a huge shift for me having to learn how to do that. And so we're really realizing that our kids' expectations are shifting. And so one of the great things with using Newsela that I love is those annotation tools. The fact that they have the 4 different colors you can highlight. The fact that the kids can write in the margins and save it, and us teachers can go check it out on their papers. They have some of those tools that are really important for us to make connections. And so when we're looking at engaging our students, really engagement is letting our students show us what they're thinking, letting our students show us what they're doing, letting our students show us how they're learning. Engaged is not sitting there quietly and flying under the radar. And so we really want to find different activities and different tools that allow us to have our students think. Because at the end of the day, for the longest time, we had our kids wanting to have A's, B's. But now I don't care if my kid has an A or B. I care if they can meet the standard and do what's being asked of them. If I'm asking you to write something and annotate on it, and I want you to be able to explain your thinking, but also find 4 pieces of evidence from the text to support your thinking, I need you to be able to do that. And there is no right or wrong answer if you're truly doing it in the right process. So I think for us, shifting that mindset of going from the right and wrong and all of that, to shifting to the idea of, show me your process of thinking and give me some evidence to support your level of thinking. That is something we definitely have to do. And that's how we're going to see engagement in our classroom. But it's definitely a mind shift, and it's definitely something that we have to watch change over time.
100%. Yeah, it's gonna take some work, but it's exciting work. I'm recognizing that we're coming up on, we have about 10 minutes left, and I want to make sure I give folks in the room a chance to ask questions. So I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen for a little bit so we can all see the grid here, and give folks a chance to ask Nicole questions, ask me questions, and just kind of give you some space, and then we'll wrap up.
Or share what you're doing.
Or share, yeah.
I could use.
Even better, yeah. We'd love to hear from you all at this point. Actually, annotation and saves can happen in our free version as well. The free version of Newsela is current events, and the paid version includes things like fiction, primary sources, things like that.
Yeah, and the paid version, I believe you can also align it with standards. I'm not sure. I know at one point the free version had the standard alignment, but I do think that has shifted over the last year.
Yeah, that's a good call
one
out.
thing with Newsela, for those of you who challenge with your districts on using students having Wi-Fi, I know it's been a challenge for us, which is why we got hotspots. If students have a cell phone and they download the Newsela app, even if they're off the data, as long as they've accessed the article once, I believe, from their phone or from their device, they can access it again without needing that Wi-Fi. So let's say they're at home, Wi-Fi goes out, or they don't have Wi-Fi. This is a way for them to re-access those articles without necessarily always having the Wi-Fi available.
Yep, that's a really, really great point. And the app is actually student facing.
Right.
Yeah, it's really cool. What other things are coming up for folks, or what other ideas have you tried that you have seen success with?
And just for Sandy too, I know you said something about struggle with changing levels. That free version changes. You can manually change levels for students and assign it to them at their level. So that is something that I really like. I do know that there was at one time, and I don't know if it's still, because I haven't used it in the classroom for about a year, but we've also been able to do it where they automatically will change for you.
Yeah, it does both, which is cool. Yeah, thanks for calling that out. Also a plug for Jamboard in the chat for both ELA and math assignments. Courtney really likes that. And then Bonnie, we can help. I think I'll send Joe, who's my colleague on the line. He can follow up with you to help you kind of figure out what's going on there. He might be able to troubleshoot what's going on for you and why it's not quite functioning. Thank you for asking that. And Sandy, thank you for your enthusiasm in the chat too. Other thoughts, Nicole, that we might want to share with the group, or other folks in the chat, anything like that? Before I have a couple resources I want to share, and then of course I want to get you Nicole's email in case you want to follow up with her directly for a brain share. I just
threw my email. Yeah, I threw my email in the chat in case anyone has questions. I used to be a Newsela certified educator. That just expired. Haven't had time to renew it. But if you have questions using the program, I would love to help you out to my best abilities. They do have a great professional development and learning community as well that many of you can use. But if you're a middle school person and you are struggling with bringing kids back, we're just starting our phase 1 back. So I'd love to hear what you're doing. So if you're doing anything and you want to share that out with me, please do, because California has made this year a very difficult one with some of our challenges. So
totally.
Just on that side note.
Thank you, Nicole. That's really helpful for folks. I know that the biggest thing I hear across the board is like having other folks to commiserate with and brainstorm with has been huge. So I think that's a really great offer. I'm going to share my screen one more time, and we're going to share this deck out after the fact. So if you're interested in taking that student engagement quiz that I talked about at the beginning, that'll be linked in the deck as well. If you're interested in reading about other folks who've used Newsela to navigate student engagement, their stories will be linked. We, of course, have a blog post, 21 tips for 2021, of course. And then the community that Nicole talked about, there's a lot of really cool stuff happening in the community where people are creating tech sets, they're providing advice about what's engaging their kids and things like that. There's some really beautiful things happening in the community, the Newsela community at large. And I know Nicole and Joe popped their emails in the chat. They're on this slide as well, as is mine. But if you need support with Newsela, Joe would be your first go-to. And then, as Nicole said, like, she's your go-to for just a thought partner and resource share and somebody to work with together. So if there are no other questions, then I'm going to wrap it up here. But I really appreciate the time you all have given us today. And Nicole, I really appreciate connecting with you. It's so cool to hear how you're doing and what you're working on. And I just really appreciate the time you've given us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Really awesome. Take care, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you all so much.
Thanks for having us. You
Thank
too.
you, guys.
Cheers.
Thanks, Joe. Appreciate it. Hey, Joe.
Hey, Tim.
Hey, guys. I want to say just a couple things, and even to people, thank you so much. Two things. We do have hundreds of schools that have been small worlds that have been open all year. So we will take you up on that invite to work with them and go through what they've learned and what they can continue to learn. And then the second thing, when I was the superintendent up in Butte County during the campfire, I really felt you have to really infuse the visual performing arts and physical and health activities with the children. It has to be outside the classroom in settings where they really work on their emotions in a positive manner. And I'm trying to push more and more of that out where it's a collective push and not all within that, an SEL model with only academic teachers. The kids really healed themselves through dance, music, and arts in that crisis and all crises. So thanks so much, you guys. Joe, thanks for stepping up today. I haven't dealt with this for a year, Corey. Traffic, bumper to bumper traffic from Sacramento to Stockton. What is going on?
It's back.
It's horrible. Oh my God. Horrible.